A woman returns to her childhood farm and uncovers a hidden room beneath the old barn, something her grandfather built in secret over 60 years ago. What she finds inside the hidden room will change everything she thought she knew about her family's past. Subscribe for more unforgettable stories, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. They say the past has a way of waiting for the right moment to speak. For Amelia, that moment came on a cold Tuesday in October, when the wind carried the scent of old hay and memory. She hadn't stepped foot on her family's farm in over 20 years, not since her mother moved away. Not since her grandfather's name had stopped being spoken around the dinner table. The farmhouse was empty now. Her mother had passed a month earlier, leaving behind boxes of dusty china, photo albums that smelled like time, and one sprawling barn that creaked in protest every time the wind blew. Amelia came back not to relive anything, just to clear it out. Close the chapter, and sell what she could. She thought it would be simple. A weekend, maybe 2, but when she stepped into that barn, the same one she used to run through barefoot as a child, something felt off. Not haunted, no, just watchful. Like the wood had seen more than it let on. She brushed her hand along the back wall and noticed a strange, hollow sound beneath the floorboards. Something was beneath her, waiting, and her grandfather had built it for a reason. Amelia stood there longer than she meant to, staring at the barn floor like it had just spoken her name. The boards looked ordinary, worn smooth by decades of boots, animals, seasons. But once you heard that hollow sound, you couldn't unhear it. It echoed inside her chest, low and insistent, like a question that had waited far too long. She fetched a flashlight from the truck and returned, kneeling where the sound had been strongest. With the beam angled just right, she noticed something she'd never seen as a child. The nails were different here, older, hand-forged. Not the kind you bought at a hardware store in the 1960s. The boards didn't quite line up with the rest of the floor. Her grandfather had done this on purpose. That realization sent a chill through her, not fear, but awe. Amelia pried up the first board slowly, half expecting the barn to protest. It didn't. The wood lifted as if it had been waiting. Beneath it was packed earth. Then another layer of boards, laid crosswise. Whoever built this wanted it hidden, wanted it forgotten. Her hands shook as she worked. Dirt crept under her nails. Dust filled the air, carrying a smell she couldn't place old paper. Maybe, or time itself. When she finally cleared enough space, she saw it, a small iron ring set into a wooden hatch. She sat back on her heels and laughed softly, a breathless sound. "Of course you did," she whispered, though she didn't know why. The hatch opened with effort, the hinges stiff from decades of silence. Cool air rose from below, brushing her face like a sigh. She aimed the flashlight down and saw a ladder, narrow and steep, disappearing into darkness. Amelia hesitated. She was alone. Cell service was spotty out here. No one knew she was in the barn. Sensible people would have closed the hatch, replaced the boards, and pretended none of this existed. But Sensible had never uncovered the truth. She climbed down. The room beneath the barn was smaller than she expected, no bigger than a modest bedroom. The walls were lined with rough stone, fitted carefully, lovingly. A low ceiling pressed down just enough to make the space feel intimate, protective. There was a cot against one wall, its mattress flattened by time but still intact. A small table, a chair, shelves carved into the stone, holding jars, candles, and neatly folded blankets. Everything was clean, not abandoned, preserved. Someone had lived here. Her flashlight caught on a wooden chest at the foot of the cot. Amelia knelt, heart pounding, and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with twine, yellowed but carefully stacked, some written in English, others in a language she didn't recognize at first German. She realized, after a moment. Tucked among them were photographs of a young man she'd never seen before, standing beside her grandfather, both of them serious, almost afraid of the camera. And then there was a journal. The cover was plain, worn smooth by handling. Amelia opened it gently, as if it might crumble in her hands. The first page read simply, "If this room is ever found, then perhaps the danger has passed." Her breath caught. She read on, slowly, the words forming a picture she had never imagined. The journal spoke of nights spent listening for engines on the road, of keeping lights low, of rationing food, of fear not for oneself, but for another. Her grandfather had built this room during the war. He had hidden someone here. Amelia sat on the cold stone floor, the journal open in her lap, tears blurring the words. All her life, she had known her grandfather as a quiet man who fixed fences, whittled wood by the fire, and never spoke of politics or the past. A man who smiled gently and asked little. She had never known the weight he carried beneath his feet. As she turned the pages, one entry stood out, written in firmer strokes. "If they find him, I will say it was my idea. I will say I forced him to stay. I am an old farmer. Let them take me instead." Amelia pressed a hand to her mouth. This wasn't just a secret room. It was a promise, a risk, a life protected by another who never asked to be remembered. She looked around the small space again, the careful construction, the supplies, the quiet dignity of it all, and understood something with painful clarity. Her grandfather hadn't built this room to hide from the world. He built it to stand up to it. And 60 years later, that courage had finally found its witness. That night, Amelia couldn't sleep. She'd returned to the farmhouse long after the sun had dipped below the tree line, the journal still clutched in her hands like a fragile relic. She'd meant to read just a few pages to get a sense of what her grandfather had done, but every sentence led to another. Every entry unraveled something inside her. The man she thought she'd known had lived 2 lives, and the second one had never been meant to be found. By morning, the frost had started to creep along the edges of the windows. The barn stood quiet, almost solemn, as she walked back toward it this time with a thermos of coffee, gloves, and a notebook of her own. She wanted to document everything. She wanted to understand. Back in the hidden room, the stillness greeted her like an old friend. The journal lay open where she'd left it. As she read further, the story sharpened. The man her grandfather had hidden was named Jacob Roth, a teacher, a violinist, a refugee. He had fled Europe in 1941 with forged papers and a scar that stretched from jaw to collarbone, a mark left by men who didn't want him to live another day. He came to America seeking safety, but found suspicion instead. Arrest, interrogation, release, silence. Until one man, Amelia's grandfather, quietly offered him sanctuary. What stunned her most wasn't just that her grandfather had taken that risk, but that Jacob had lived there for over a year, and no one had ever known. Halfway through the journal, tucked between 2 pages, Amelia found a faded photograph she hadn't noticed the night before. This one was different. Jacob was seated on the edge of the cot, violin in hand, eyes cast downward, and next to him, leaning against the wall, was a small girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, blonde, holding a stuffed rabbit. Amelia's chest tightened. She knew that rabbit. It had sat in her mother's attic trunk for years. She flipped the photo over. In faint pencil, someone had written, Anna, spring 1945. Anna, that was her mother's name. Her hands trembled as she looked closer. Her mother so young, smiling shyly at a man she had never once mentioned. Amelia raced back to the farmhouse. Heart pounding, lungs aching. She dug through the attic, tearing open old chests, boxes of clothes, forgotten photo albums. In one of them, stuck between pages of yellowed newspaper, was a folded sheet of stationery, the same handwriting as the journal. Jacob's. To the girl with the rabbit. Thank you for your songs. They reminded me of the ones my sister used to sing. I hope you never forget how powerful music can be. J. The words were small, neat, full of gratitude. Her mother had known him. Maybe not his full story, maybe not the danger, but enough to remember his music, enough to visit him. Why hadn't she ever said anything? Why keep it buried? Amelia spent the rest of the day reading the last entries. The tone shifted. Jacob's writing grew shakier, more uncertain. He wrote of feeling like a burden, of fearing discovery, of the guilt he carried for surviving when others hadn't. I miss my sister every time I hear a piano. I miss being someone whose name could be said aloud. His final entry was dated June 1945. It read, I heard the news on the radio today. The war is over. I don't know what that means for me, but I wept. I wept like a man being born again. There were no entries after that. No explanation. No goodbye. Amelia searched the room again. Carefully this time. She checked the walls, behind the cot, beneath the table. Then, under a loose floor tile near the far corner, she found it. A worn leather satchel. Inside, a violin wrapped in cloth, a small notebook filled with music notes, and an envelope addressed simply to the person who finds this. Amelia sat down and opened it. Inside was a letter, written with the same elegant hand. If this place remains, then I am gone. I don't know if I ever found the courage to leave, or if I stayed too long in fear, but if you are reading this, then you are free. You live in a world I once prayed for. Please remember those who didn't make it here. Play a song for them. Say their names. That is all I ask. She couldn't stop the tears this time. Not just for Jacob, not just for her grandfather, but for the silence between generations, for the stories buried under floorboards, waiting to be unearthed by someone who cared enough to listen. And now, she had found it. Not just the hidden room, but the truth that was never meant to stay hidden forever. That night, Amelia sat in the living room where her grandfather used to read by the fireplace. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the cold. She wrapped herself in one of the blankets she'd brought up from the hidden room. It still carried the faint scent of earth and time. On the coffee table before her lay a puzzle of artifacts, Jacob's final letter. The violin, the photograph of her mother, and the notebook filled with sheet music. But most of all, her grandfather's journal. She didn't open it this time. She just stared at it. And for the first time in her life, she saw her grandfather not as the silent old man who grew tomatoes and fixed gates, but as someone who had once risked everything to save another. She remembered his hands rough, calloused, always busy. She used to think they were just a farmer's hands. Now she knew they were the hands of a builder, a protector, a man who chose courage in the face of fear and kept that choice buried under silence for the rest of his life. The next morning, Amelia called her aunt her mother's younger sister. They hadn't spoken much since the funeral, but this couldn't wait. "Did you know?" Amelia asked, her voice low. There was a pause on the other end, Then, about the room, her aunt whispered, "Yes." Amelia blinked. "What?" "I only found out after your mother died." Her aunt continued, "I found the same photo you did. But I didn't go looking. I didn't want to disturb anything." "You didn't want to know?" Amelia asked, stunned. Her aunt sighed. "We all have different ways of honoring the past. Your mom, she never spoke about it. But she kept that rabbit. She never threw it away." Amelia felt her throat tighten. "She remembered him, didn't she?" she asked. "I think so," her aunt said. "But maybe she didn't know how to talk about it. Maybe she thought it would make her memories of Grandpa too heavy." That was the moment Amelia's perspective shifted for good. It wasn't just about her grandfather anymore. It was about the way stories live or die depending on who chooses to tell them. All this time, she had blamed the silence in her family as something cold, uncaring. But now, she realized it might have been grief, or reverence, or simply fear of getting it wrong. But she didn't want to get it perfect. She just didn't want to let it disappear. That afternoon, she returned to the hidden room. This time, she didn't come to dig through the past. She came to listen. She sat on the cot, opened Jacob's notebook, and looked at the music. It was beautiful even just on paper. She couldn't read all of it, but the title said enough for Anna. The Garden Waltz, Midnight Without a Moon. Each one felt like a whisper meant for someone who never got to hear it. So she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder, and she began to read the letter out loud. Then, one by one, she photographed every page of the journal. She scanned the music. She carefully documented the room, from the stone walls to the shelf of jars, not for curiosity's sake, but because some stories deserve to outlive the walls that held them. Later that week, she called the local historical society. A man named Lawrence answered. He sounded tired, but polite. She told him about the barn, about the room, about Jacob. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Lawrence said, "My grandfather used to talk about a man who vanished from town during the war. No one ever found out what happened to him. He was a school teacher, played violin in the chapel." Amelia's chest caught. His name. Jacob Roth, Lawrence said. "Why?" Amelia smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Because I found him." A week later, Amelia stood in front of the town's tiny historical museum, a red brick building that used to be a train station, now converted into a quiet space where forgotten things were given a second chance to be remembered. She held a box in her arms. Inside, Jacob's violin, the journal, the sheet music, and a carefully sealed envelope addressed to the person who finds this. The same envelope that had changed everything. Lawrence met her at the door. His gray cardigan was dusted with lint, and he smelled faintly of old books and peppermint. "I've never seen someone bring history in a cardboard box before," he smiled. Amelia gave a half laugh. "I didn't know how else to carry it." They sat at a wooden table near the back of the museum. Amelia began carefully laying out each item, telling the story, piece by piece, the journal entries. The photograph of her mother, the letter, the secret room beneath the barn. Lawrence listened with the quiet focus of someone unwrapping a family heirloom. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "You understand what this is, right?" he asked. Amelia nodded. "It's more than just a hidden room. It's proof," he said, "of resistance, of compassion, of a man who risked his life not to fight, but to protect." She swallowed hard. "I think he just didn't know how to live with doing nothing." The next day, Lawrence called her. "I spoke with a contact at the regional archives," he said. "They've been building a digital memorial for displaced persons who vanished during World War II. Jacob Roth is listed as missing, presumed dead. Amelia blinked. But he didn't die. He made it here. Yes, Lawrence said. But no one knew that. His family never found him. No grave. No closure. There was a pause. If you're willing, he continued, we could submit what you found, update the record, give him a place, a name. Amelia felt her throat tighten. It was one thing to read a stranger's story. It was another to return them to the world. Yes, she said softly, let's do it. In the weeks that followed, something shifted inside her. She returned to the barn, often not to search, but to sit, to feel the air in that quiet stone room, to imagine Jacob writing by candlelight, to imagine her grandfather listening for danger outside, to imagine a little girl handing over her stuffed rabbit to comfort a man the world had forgotten. She started playing music again. She'd given up the piano years ago, too busy, too tired, too far from who she used to be. But something about Jacob's story made her long to feel the keys under her fingers again. So she found an old upright piano on Facebook Marketplace and had it delivered to the farmhouse. The first song she played wasn't perfect. Her fingers stumbled. But it was his song, the one titled For Anna. And as the melody filled the room, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not grief, not even nostalgia, but presence. Jacob had lived in silence to survive. Her grandfather had stayed silent to protect. Now she would use her voice not just for them, but for herself. A month later, the museum hosted a small exhibit called The Hidden Room. People came from nearby towns. Some brought their own stories. Others came just to listen. The violin was displayed in a glass case, next to Jacob's final letter. The journal sat open to the entry dated June 1945. And on the wall hung a photograph of two men standing side by side, Jacob and Amelia's grandfather. The caption beneath it read, "Not all heroes wore uniforms. Some built walls to shelter. Others stayed silent so others could live." As Amelia stood in the gallery, watching strangers read Jacob's words, she realized something. What her grandfather had done wasn't just brave, it was generationally redemptive. He had saved a life, and now, that life, his act was saving others from forgetting. Winter came early that year. Frost curled along the edges of the farmhouse windows, and the barn stood cloaked in soft snow. Like it, too, was exhaling after so many decades of holding its breath. But inside Amelia, something entirely different was happening. She couldn't stop writing. At first, it was just journaling notes about Jacob, about her grandfather, about what she'd found. But slowly, quietly, those notes became pages of something larger, a manuscript, a story, not fiction, but not quite history either, something in between, something human. Each morning, she made coffee and sat at the old kitchen table, the same place where her grandfather used to sip quietly while reading the paper. She wrote longhand at first, then typed it all up at night. She didn't plan to publish it, but sometimes when the truth finally finds light, it refuses to stay quiet. One snowy afternoon, Amelia got a call from Lawrence at the museum. "There's someone you should meet," he said. He sounded excited, nervous, careful. "She's been doing research on missing Holocaust survivors in the U.S. for years. She saw the exhibit. She thinks she might be related to Jacob." Amelia's heart skipped. "Seriously?" "She's flying in next week." Her name was Elise Roth. She was in her 70s, thin, sharp-eyed, with silver hair pinned neatly back and a scarf around her neck that looked like it had seen Paris, Vienna, and maybe a protest or two. They met at the museum. Elise carried a worn leather binder with her. Inside were photos, documents, letters. She placed a photo on the table between them. It was Jakob as a young man, smiling gently beside a girl of about 12. "That's my mother," Elise said. "His sister. He vanished in 1941. We thought he died on the ship or was sent back. We never knew what happened." Amelia felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "He lived," she whispered. Elise nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You've given us back a part of our family." Amelia's voice caught. "I think he gave us all something." They spent hours together, comparing notes. Amelia shared the journal. Elise brought a recording, an old cassette of Jakob playing violin from before the war, digitized by her grandson. When Amelia heard it, something inside her cracked open. It was the same melody she'd been trying to learn, the one Jakob had written in the hidden room. For Anna. A few days later, Elise asked if she could see the barn. Amelia hesitated. She hadn't brought anyone else down into the hidden room before. It felt sacred somehow. But Elise wasn't a stranger to that silence. She carried her own. They walked out in boots and scarves, breath visible in the cold air. Inside the barn, Amelia pried open the old boards, just as she had weeks ago. The hatch creaked. They descended carefully, Elise gripping Amelia's arm for balance. When they stepped inside, Elise covered her mouth. The room was just as Jakob had left it, spare, humble, brave. She walked slowly, reverently, as though afraid to disturb something still breathing. When she reached the cot, she sat gently and placed a photograph beside it. Jakob and his sister, reunited, at least in some small way. That night, Amelia didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, staring at the pages she'd written, the photo Elise had given her, and the violin resting quietly in the corner. She knew now she couldn't keep this just for herself. Jakob's story wasn't just about survival. Her grandfather's story wasn't just about bravery. Together, they were about legacy, about how ordinary people leave behind extraordinary echoes if someone's willing to listen. She opened her laptop and typed the words she'd been circling around for weeks. Based on a true story. The next day, she emailed a publisher. The book came out the following spring. It wasn't flashy. The cover was simple, just a faded photograph of the barn at dusk, with a soft light glowing beneath it, like something alive was still waiting down there. The title, The Hidden Room. Amelia never expected much. She thought maybe a few locals would read it, maybe a family or two who'd visited the museum. But she underestimated the power of one quiet story told honestly. Within weeks, word spread. First local radio, then regional news, then a national feature on stories history forgot but memory preserved. Messages flooded in from strangers who had found letters in their attics, journals behind walls, photos in the back of drawers, survivors, descendants. People who had always wondered if they were the only ones carrying a family secret they didn't know how to tell. Amelia responded to every message. Some shared gratitude, some shared grief. Some just said, "Thank you for showing me it's not too late." One morning, she received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address, just an old stamp and careful script. Inside was a note. "My father used to speak of a man with kind eyes who helped him during the war. We never knew his name, I think now. It might have been Jakob. Your story helped me understand the kind of man my father became. Thank you, E." Amelia sat at the kitchen table, tears spilling silently into her coffee. Months passed. The museum made the exhibit permanent. Schools began bringing students. Veterans stopped by, hats in hand, pausing longest at the glass case where Jacob's violin rested. One little boy asked Amelia during a tour, "Did Jacob ever get to play his music again?" She smiled softly and knelt beside him. "He did," she said. "He played in secret, so the world would stay quiet enough for someone else to live." The biggest surprise came on a clear summer afternoon. Amelia stood outside the barn, now lovingly restored. The boards had been reinforced, but the entrance to the hidden room remained, as it was discreet, unmarked, sacred. She was gathering wildflowers for the house when a car pulled up. An older man stepped out broad shoulders, walking cane, eyes the color of stormy skies. He introduced himself as David Roth, Jakob's great-nephew. He'd flown in from Austria. He'd read the book, visited the digital archive, and tracked Amelia down. "I don't want anything," he said. "I just needed to stand here, where he was." They walked the land in silence. Later, Amelia took him down to the hidden room. David didn't speak at first, just stood there, one hand on the stone wall, his head bowed. He was the only one in our family who disappeared without a trace, David said. Now, he's the one who will never be forgotten. That night, Amelia lit a single candle in the room and placed it beside Jakob's final letter. She sat on the cot, notebook in hand, and wrote her last page. "To the man I never met. Thank you for trusting my grandfather. Thank you for teaching me that bravery isn't always loud, sometimes. It's a door built in secret, a melody played in darkness, a silence that saves." The story wasn't just history now. It had become something living, breathing, a bridge between generations, a testament to what kindness done in secret can become when finally brought into the light. They say we are made of stories. Some are passed down, some are discovered. Some wait patiently beneath barn floors for someone, someday, to care enough to listen. Amelia listened, and because of that, the world remembered. Some stories are hidden not to be forgotten, but to be protected. Jakob's life was spared because one man quiet, unassuming, and ordinary in every way chose to act in silence. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't write about it. He simply opened his hands, built a room, and said, "Stay." Amelia's discovery wasn't just about uncovering a room. It was about opening a door to truth, compassion, and memory. And in doing so, she didn't just preserve a secret, she gave it a voice. Sometimes, legacy isn't about what we leave behind, it's about who we leave it for. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe. More stories like this, quiet but powerful, are waiting to be told.